My name is Florence. I am 26 years old, and I melt bronze for a living. I know the exact temperature required to fuse structural steel the way most people know their own phone number. I spend my days in a New Haven warehouse wrestling raw materials, calculating load paths, and operating heavy machinery. The work leaves permanent calluses on my palms and soot under my fingernails. My boots are scarred by rogue sparks, and my hands carry the map of 1,000 minor burns. I love the heat. I love the friction. I love the tangible reality of building something from nothing. So when my Uncle Richard left a voicemail threatening to freeze my family trust account unless I abandoned my studio to become his administrative assistant, I should have felt afraid. I did not. I stood in my foundry wearing a heavy leather apron and listened to a man who handles hedge funds try to explain reality to a woman who bends metal. The contrast was almost funny. The recording echoed over the sharp, mechanical hiss of argon gas and the hum of industrial ventilation fans. Richard spoke with the practiced cadence of someone who assumes the world is waiting for his permission to spin. He thought he had cornered me. He thought the threat of financial starvation would break my spirit and force me into his corporate mold. He wanted me fetching coffee wearing sensible heels and filing reports just to prove a point about obedience. He had not bothered to check that I had not touched a single dime of that trust fund in 3 years. My independence was already secured through my own labor. He also had no idea that the kinetic sculpture cooling on my workbench was the anchor piece for a classified 7-figure commission. Most importantly, my uncle did not know that his own failing investment firm was weeks away from stepping right into a trap built out of my intellectual property. He viewed me as a fiscal liability, a naive girl playing with clay while the real adults handled the legacy. He believed that because I chose creation over extraction, I was weak. I looked at the 2-ton bronze assembly towering in the center of the room. It was beautiful, imposing, and entirely mine. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, turned off the gas tank, and deleted his message. I was not a victim. I was the architect of my own life. But the family threat was real, and it required a precise, calculated response. Welcome back to Luke Vengeance, where ordinary people turn the tables on toxic families and walk out with their dignity intact. If you have ever had your life choices mocked by the people who are supposed to support you, let me know your age in the comments and hit subscribe. You will want to hear how this ends. To understand how a single brass plaque brought a Wall Street titan to his knees, I need to take you back 48 hours before that voicemail. I need to take you to the dining room of my family estate in Connecticut on Thanksgiving. The Montgomery house sits at the end of a long gravel driveway lined with ancient oak trees. It is the kind of old money estate that feels less like a home and more like a museum where you are never allowed to touch the exhibits. The dining room smelled of roasted pheasant, expensive floor wax, and the quiet, suffocating pressure of inherited expectations. In my family, success has a very rigid dress code. You are either a doctor, a corporate lawyer, or you manage portfolios on Wall Street. Anything else is considered a polite embarrassment. My parents sat at opposite ends of the mahogany table, performing their annual ritual of dissecting their children. My older brother Preston sat across from me. Preston is an orthopedic surgeon. My parents treat his medical degree like a religious artifact. They talk about his surgical residency the way other people talk about winning the lottery. Beside Preston sat his wife, Valerie. Valerie is a corporate compliance attorney from a working-class Boston Irish neighborhood. She worked her way through law school tending bar and has zero patience for the Montgomery brand of passive aggression. She is also the only person at the table who ever looked at me like I was a functioning adult. I watched Valerie slice her pheasant, her eyes flicking toward the head of the table with the precise, calculating look she saves for hostile witnesses. The head of the table belonged to Uncle Richard. Richard runs a hedge fund in Greenwich. He wears custom suits, drinks scotch that costs more than my monthly rent, and speaks exclusively in monologues. He spent the first 2 courses detailing his latest corporate acquisitions, talking about liquidating regional supply chains like it was a casual sport. He paused only to let my father nod in agreement. As the plates were being cleared, Richard turned his attention to me. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass, and asked how my little Yale art experiment was going. I kept my voice level. I told him my studio was busy and I had a major exhibition coming up. My mother touched her pearls. It is a nervous habit she developed whenever the conversation veered away from acceptable country club topics. She sighed, a sharp intake of breath she uses to signal profound disappointment. My father rested his silverware on his plate and said it was time to put the clay away. He said an art degree from Yale was a lovely finishing school exercise, but it was not a career. They did not ask about the exhibition. They did not ask what I was building. They had decided years ago that because I did not wear a stethoscope or carry a briefcase, I was playing make-believe. Richard leaned forward and placed his hands flat on the table. He said he had a solution to my lack of direction. He offered me a job at his firm. He did not offer it like a gift. He offered it like a judge handing down a sentence. He said I would start at the bottom, fetching coffee and filing reports for his junior analysts. He told the table it would teach me discipline and show me how real wealth is generated. He quoted statistics about the failure rate of independent artists, reading the numbers like a verdict. I looked at the faces around the table. My mother was smiling, relieved that someone was finally stepping in to fix her broken daughter. My father nodded, raising his glass to Richard. Preston stared at his plate, choosing silence over conflict. Valerie reached over and passed me the salt shaker. As our hands brushed, she offered a microscopic smirk, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. She saw the performance. She saw the ego masking a deep, unsaid panic. I set the salt shaker down. I told Richard I appreciated his concern, but my studio required my full attention. The room went silent. The temperature in the dining room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Richard did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply smiled a thin, humorless smile. He said we would continue this conversation tomorrow in his office. He said if I did not show up, he would initiate a full financial audit of the Montgomery Generational Trust. He planned to show me exactly how cold the world gets when the family stops paying the heating bill. The chairs pushed back from the mahogany table in synchronized scrapes against the hardwood floor. My mother signaled the end of the meal with a polite fold of her linen napkin. The Thanksgiving ritual dictated that the family relocate to the library for after-dinner drinks. It was a seamless transition from one suffocating room to another. The Montgomery Library was not designed for quiet reading or quiet reflection. It was a staging ground for lectures. The walls were lined with first-edition books that no one ever opened, and oil portraits of ancestors who built their fortunes in maritime shipping. The air in the room felt heavy-scented with old paper lemon oil and the lingering smoke of unlit cigars. I took a seat in a high-backed leather chair near the window. I kept my posture straight and my hands folded in my lap. I was playing the role they expected. I was the errant daughter waiting for her sentence to be handed down. Richard walked straight to the antique brass bar cart in the corner. He did not ask anyone what they wanted to drink. He poured for himself first. I watched his reflection in the mirrored backsplash of the cart. He reached for a heavy crystal decanter filled with aged scotch. As he lifted the stopper, the glass chimed faintly against the rim. His hand was shaking. It was a subtle vibration, the kind you might miss if you were not trained to look for structural weaknesses. I work with volatile metals and high-pressure gases. I know how to spot a hairline fracture before it causes a catastrophic failure. Richard Montgomery projected the image of an invincible Wall Street titan. He boasted about liquidating companies and buying vacation homes in cash. Men who control the universe do not tremble while pouring a drink. That tiny tremor told me a story he was desperately trying to hide. His hedge fund was under stress. The swagger at the dinner table was a performance masking a deep internal panic. He was bleeding capital, and he needed an audience to feel powerful again. Tonight, I was the chosen target. My mother settled onto the velvet sofa, arranging her silk skirt with pristine care. She looked at me with an expression of manufactured pity. She said the family simply could not watch me squander my potential any longer. She framed her embarrassment as maternal concern. She told me that women in our social circle were asking questions about my future, and she was running out of polite excuses. My father leaned against the stone fireplace, swirling a glass of sparkling water. He added his weight to the conversation with cold, surgical precision. He explained that funding an adult child who refused to participate in the real economy was a poor investment. He used the word investment instead of family. That was how my parents measured love. Love was a dividend paid out only when you met their specific metrics of success. Preston stood near the doorway checking his phone. My brother hates conflict, unless he is the one winning it. He pretended to read an urgent email from his hospital, stepping back into the shadow of the hallway to avoid the crossfire. Valerie did not hide. My sister-in-law leaned against the bookshelf a few feet away from me. She held a cup of black coffee, her dark eyes tracking every word Richard spoke. Valerie navigated corporate boardrooms for a living. She recognized a hostile negotiation tactic instantly. She took a slow sip of her coffee and let her gaze drift to the shaking crystal decanter in Richard's hand. She saw the tremor too. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. She did not smile this time. She just gave a nearly imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement that the man lecturing me was standing on hollow ground. Richard turned around, drink in hand, and approached my chair. He looked down at me, using his height to enforce his authority. He said my rebellion had reached its expiration date. He was prepared to offer me a junior administrative role at his firm, starting the first of the month. He described the position in humiliating detail. I would be managing schedules, fetching dry cleaning for the senior partners, and sitting at a desk outside his office where he could monitor my hours. He said it was the only way to teach me the value of $1. I traced the edge of a small burn scar on my thumb, keeping my face perfectly neutral. I thought about my studio in New Haven. I thought about the raw steel waiting to be cut, the heat of the foundry, and the sheer physical power required to bend metal to my will. He wanted me fetching coffee. Richard took a sip of his scotch and delivered the ultimatum. He gave me exactly 30 days. I had 1 month to clear out my industrial workspace, abandon my tools, and report to his front desk in a gray suit. If I refused, the family would initiate a full legal audit of the generational trust fund. My father nodded from the fireplace, confirming the threat. They would freeze the accounts, sever my access to the Montgomery estate, and ensure I was socially exiled from every influential circle in Connecticut. They believed they were cutting off my oxygen. They assumed my art was a vanity project funded by their wealth. They did not know that my bank account was fine. They did not know I had severed my own reliance on their money 3 years ago, living quietly on the proceeds of anonymous private commissions. The trust fund was a phantom chain. I could have laughed. I could have stood up, listed my real net worth, and walked out the front door. But pride is an expensive emotion. If I revealed my independence now, they would dig into my life. They would leverage their connections to uncover my studio LLC. They would find out about the upcoming Vanguard exhibition and use their influence to sabotage my debut, just to force me back under their control. I needed them blind. I needed them complacent. I had to let them believe they held the leash. I lowered my eyes, playing the part of the defeated daughter. I kept my voice quiet and unsteady. I told Richard I understood his terms. I said I needed time to process the transition and wrap up my current lease. Richard smiled, the tension drained from his shoulders. He believed he had won. He patted the back of my leather chair, a patronizing gesture of victory. He told me I was making the smart choice. My mother exhaled a long breath of relief, already planning how she would spin my new corporate job to her country club friends. My father finally smiled, raising his glass to me. The room relaxed, satisfied that the natural order of the Montgomery universe had been restored. I excused myself shortly after. I walked down the long hallway, retrieved my coat, and stepped out into the freezing Connecticut night. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked to my heavily used truck, parked far away from my parents' polished luxury sedans. I climbed into the cab, turned the key, and let the engine roar to life. The heater blasted cold air against my face. The trap at the dinner table was temporarily diffused, but the clock was ticking. 30 days. I had 1 month to finalize the largest bronze casting of my career and deliver it to the Vanguard Arts Group. As I drove down the dark, tree-lined highway toward New Haven, my phone buzzed on the dashboard. It was a calendar reminder for the next morning. I had a scheduled meeting with my private art broker to discuss the final logistics for the Greenwich exhibition. I needed to secure my anonymity and lock down the installation details. I gripped the steering wheel, the calluses on my hands catching against the worn leather. I survived the holiday audit, but I knew the peace was an illusion. The real battle was just beginning, and the stakes were about to rise higher than my family could ever imagine. The morning after Thanksgiving brought a bitter frost to the Connecticut coastline. The sky was the color of hammered lead as I parked my heavily used truck outside a sleek glass building in downtown New Haven. The architecture of the commercial district was sharp and modern. It was a deliberate rejection of the colonial aesthetic my parents worshipped. I rode the silent elevator to the top floor, my boots leaving faint traces of foundry dust on the polished marble. The steel doors parted, opening into the private office of Elias Thorne. Elias was my art broker. He was a man who navigated the invisible, high-stakes channels of the international art market. He wore bespoke Italian suits, spoke 4 languages, and possessed a terrifying memory for numbers. He had plucked my early steel sculptures from a crowded university showcase 3 years ago. Through quiet introductions and closed-door auctions, Elias transformed my anonymous limited liability company into a highly sought-after brand. He was the architect of my financial independence. We were supposed to spend this Friday morning finalizing the transport logistics for the upcoming Greenwich exhibition. The 2-ton bronze kinetic piece sitting in my warehouse needed a specialized crane and a reinforced flatbed truck. Elias did not greet me with his usual polished smile. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the frozen harbor. His shoulders carried a rigid tension that I had never seen before. A thick manila folder rested on the center of his clear glass desk. He turned around and gestured for me to sit in the low leather chair opposite him. He did not offer his customary espresso. He told me the logistics meeting was canceled. He said we had a structural emergency regarding the Vanguard Arts Group. Vanguard was not just a local gallery. It was a global holding company, a corporate umbrella that sheltered billions of dollars in blue-chip art across international borders. They hosted the Greenwich exhibition as a flagship event to attract wealthy New England investors. I was their anchor artist for the season. I sat back and waited for Elias to explain the crisis. He sat across from me, opened the folder, and slid a stack of dense financial documents forward. Elias explained that Vanguard was bleeding cash in their European division. They were overextended and vulnerable to a buyout. Over the last 48 hours, a ruthless Connecticut-based hedge fund had launched a hostile corporate takeover. The predator firm was systematically purchasing Vanguard debt, preparing to force a mandatory buyout vote before the end of the quarter. They did not care about the art. They wanted the holding company to access its vast, tax-sheltered asset portfolio. The hedge fund needed liquid capital to cover their own failing margins, and Vanguard was the perfect target to strip and sell. I looked down at the documents. The bold ink at the top of the page listed the acquiring firm. It was my uncle's company. Richard Montgomery was the predator circling Vanguard. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a sickening clarity. The shaking crystal decanter in the library, the boastful monologues at the dinner table. Richard was drowning in bad leverage. His entire arrogant performance the night before was a smokescreen. He was executing a desperate corporate raid to save his sinking ship. I kept my breathing slow and steady. I asked Elias how a change in corporate ownership affected my upcoming exhibition. Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on the glass. He said the threat went far beyond a single night in Greenwich. He reminded me of the exclusivity contract my company signed with Vanguard 18 months ago. In exchange for premium gallery space and high-dollar representation, Vanguard held the right of first refusal on all my structural output for the next 5 years. The contract was a tangible asset owned by the holding company. If Richard successfully acquired Vanguard, he would absorb my contract. I stared at the signature line on the document, processing the sheer weight of the threat. The man who had sat at the head of a mahogany table 12 hours ago and ordered me to fetch his dry cleaning was currently plotting a legal maneuver that would grant him total ownership of my intellectual property. He would dictate my production schedule. He would own the copyrights to my bronze castings. He would profit off every hour I spent sweating behind a welding torch. Richard was attempting to buy my entire professional existence by sheer accident. He thought I was a worthless failure, yet he was betting his financial survival on a corporate portfolio anchored by my secret labor. The irony was suffocating, but the danger was lethal. I asked Elias how close the acquisition was to closing. Elias rubbed his temples, a rare display of exhaustion. He said the Greenwich Modern Art Gala was the final battleground. Richard had purchased a premium table for the event. He was using the gala to corner the Vanguard board of directors and force them to sign a preliminary acquisition agreement in the VIP lounge. My family had demanded I attend that exact same gala to observe real success. They were bringing me along as a prop. I was supposed to be a cautionary tale paraded in front of their wealthy peers while Richard quietly signed the paperwork to enslave my future. They wanted me to watch my own execution without realizing the axe was falling on my neck. I stood up from the glass desk. Elias asked if I wanted to pull the centerpiece and cancel the show. He said we could cite technical difficulties and hide the bronze in a climate-controlled storage facility until the corporate warfare settled. I looked at my broker. Retreating meant sacrificing the biggest debut of my career. It meant running away and letting Richard win through blind luck. I told Elias the exhibition would proceed exactly as planned. I told him to hire the crane, reinforce the flatbed, and transport the sculpture to the museum under heavy tarps. I left the office and walked back out into the freezing wind. The rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. This was no longer a domestic dispute over a Thanksgiving turkey or a petty argument about career choices. This was high-stakes corporate warfare. I drove back to my industrial workspace, my mind racing through legal loopholes and contract law. I needed a structural defense. I needed a mechanism to turn my contract from a passive asset into an active weapon. I pulled my truck into the narrow brick alleyway behind the foundry. I grabbed my keys to unlock the heavy rolling doors, ready to spend the next 10 hours formulating a legal counterattack. I stopped halfway across the pavement. A sleek black sedan was parked in my designated loading zone. The engine was off, but the interior lights were glowing. A figure stepped out into the cold, leaning against the driver's side door and holding a slim leather briefcase. It was Valerie. My Boston Irish sister-in-law was standing outside my secret studio, miles away from the Montgomery estate, watching me with that same calculating expression she wore at the dinner table. She had tracked me down. The collision of my two worlds had just arrived at my doorstep, and I had no idea if she was carrying a peace treaty or a declaration of war. The wind off the harbor whipped through the brick alleyway, biting through my canvas jacket. Valerie stood perfectly still next to her sedan. She wore a tailored charcoal trench coat and leather gloves, looking entirely out of place against the backdrop of rusted dumpsters and cracked pavement. My sister-in-law was the external compliance counsel for Richard's firm. Her presence here was a glaring breach of family protocol. We did not socialize outside of mandatory holiday dinners. I tightened my grip on my key ring. I asked her if she was lost. Valerie did not smile. She looked up at the faded brick facade of my building. She said she was taking a scenic drive and decided to admire the local industrial architecture. Her tone was flat, stripped of the polite warmth she used to survive my mother's country club luncheons. I unlocked the heavy steel door and pushed it open. I told her she might as well come inside before the frost ruined her coat. The foundry was dark, illuminated only by the sharp shafts of morning light cutting through the frosted skylights. The air held the permanent scent of scorched iron grinding dust and argon gas. I flicked the main breaker. The overhead industrial lamps hummed to life, casting a harsh yellow glow over my workspace. Valerie stepped over the threshold, the heels of her boots clicking against the concrete floor. She stopped walking. She was staring at the center of the room. The 2-ton kinetic bronze sculpture towered above us. It was a complex assembly of gears, counterweights, and polished metal curves, designed to move with the ambient air currents. It looked like a machine built to measure time, heavy and relentless. Valerie walked slowly around the base, tracing the clean weld lines with her eyes. She did not touch it. She respected the danger of heavy machinery. She looked at my workbenches. She saw the plasma cutter, the heavy-duty angle grinders, and the racks of raw structural steel. She looked at my calloused hands, then down at her own pristine leather gloves. Valerie grew up in a working-class Boston Irish neighborhood. Her father was a union pipe fitter. She clawed her way through law school, working double shifts at a dive bar, only to marry into a family that measured worth by inherited trust funds. She recognized labor. She recognized grit. She looked back at the sculpture and said, "My father was an idiot." I walked over to the break area and poured 2 cups of black coffee from a battered thermos. I handed her one. I told her the Montgomery family excelled at seeing only what they wanted to see. Valerie took a sip, her dark eyes locking onto mine. She said people who inherit their power often underestimate people who build it. She set her briefcase down on a metal drum. She did not open it. As an attorney, she was bound by strict confidentiality laws. Handing me internal corporate documents would be career-ending malpractice. Valerie was too smart to risk her license for family drama. Instead, she leaned against the drum and told me she wanted to discuss a theoretical legal scenario. I leaned against my workbench, crossing my arms. I told her I was listening. Valerie looked at the ceiling, pretending to construct a hypothetical situation. She said, "Imagine a hedge fund manager who made several disastrous bets on commercial real estate. Imagine this manager is bleeding capital so fast he is facing a catastrophic liquidity crisis. To save his firm, he needs to acquire a global holding company. He needs a target with a pristine international asset portfolio he can liquidate to cover his margin calls." She paused, letting the weight of the scenario settle in the cold air. She continued. She said this hypothetical hedge fund manager finds the perfect target, a premier arts group. He plans to launch a hostile takeover, cornering the board of directors into signing a preliminary acquisition agreement. He assumes art is just pretty wallpaper. He looks at the balance sheets, but he ignores the fine print. I took a slow breath. I asked her what kind of fine print a hedge fund manager might miss. Valerie smiled a sharp, predatory expression. She said corporate raiders always look at the physical assets. They look at the gallery real estate and the inventory in the vaults, but they often have a blind spot regarding intellectual property. They forget that the real value of an art holding company is the exclusive contracts they hold with their top creators. She looked directly at the bronze centerpiece. She said if a visionary creator was smart, they would never sign a standard exhibition contract. A smart creator would hire a cutthroat intellectual property lawyer to insert a change of ownership clause. The pieces of the legal puzzle clicked together in my mind. Valerie explained the mechanics of a poison pill. If a holding company undergoes a hostile change in ownership without the explicit written consent of the creator, the exhibition contract becomes instantly void. The creator retains the legal right to pull their artwork from the galleries. They can revoke all future commissions. If the anchor artist walks away, the projected valuation of the holding company plummets overnight. The acquiring hedge fund does not inherit a gold mine. They inherit an empty shell, and the resulting debt forces them into immediate receivership. Valerie picked up her briefcase. She said it was just a thought experiment. She told me to stay warm, turned on her heel, and walked out the heavy steel door. I stood alone in the foundry. The silence was profound. Valerie had not broken attorney-client privilege. She had not given me a single document. She had simply walked into my studio and handed me the exact structural blueprint required to destroy my uncle. Richard thought he was backing me into a corner. He thought he was hunting me. He did not realize I was the one holding the rifle. I walked to my desk and picked up the phone. I called my lead attorney. She was a ruthless litigator based in Manhattan who specialized in high-stakes intellectual property. I told her we needed to amend my final contract with Vanguard Arts immediately. I dictated the terms of the poison pill exactly as Valerie had described. I added one final stipulation. I required a specific independent appraiser, a woman fiercely loyal to my own company, to authorize any final asset transfer. My attorney noted my tone. She asked if I was preparing for a war. I told her the war was already here. I was just building the landmines. The contract amendment was drafted, signed, and legally filed within 4 hours. My bronze sculpture was loaded onto the reinforced flatbed truck under the cover of darkness, bound for the Greenwich Museum. The trap was set, hidden beneath layers of corporate legalese. All I needed was for Richard to step onto the trigger. The mechanism to lure him in arrived the next morning. I was sweeping the concrete floor when a private courier pulled into the alleyway. He carried a heavy gold-embossed envelope. It was not addressed to my business. It was addressed to Florence Montgomery. I tore open the thick paper. Inside was a VIP invitation to the Greenwich Modern Art Gala. A small handwritten note on personalized stationery was clipped to the front. The handwriting belonged to my mother. She wrote that Richard had purchased a premium table for the family. She said they expected me to attend as their guest. She wrote that it was time for me to observe what real wealth and true success looked like in the real world. She told me to wear something appropriate and not embarrass them. I read the note twice. The arrogance was staggering. They were not inviting me to share a cultural experience. They were dragging me to the gala as a psychological battering ram. They wanted to parade me in front of Connecticut high society as a cautionary tale. They wanted me to look at the millionaires in the room and feel small, hoping the humiliation would break my spirit before Richard's 30-day trust fund deadline expired. They also planned to use that very same gala to corner the Vanguard director into signing the preliminary acquisition agreement. Richard was going to execute his hostile takeover in the VIP lounge, surrounded by his cheering family. I looked at the gold lettering on the invitation. I was going to be in that room. I was going to stand right next to my uncle while he signed the document that would trigger my poison pill and bankrupt his entire firm. He wanted me to watch him win. I walked to my small office closet and pulled out a simple, unbranded black dress. I did not need flashy designer labels to prove my worth. I had a 2-ton bronze anchor piece waiting under a velvet drape and a legally binding contract waiting in the shadows. I set the dress on my chair. I would attend their gala. I would endure their whispers and their mocking smiles. I would play the defeated daughter one last time. The drive down the Connecticut coast to Greenwich took less than an hour, but it felt like crossing a border between two distinct realities. I parked my battered truck in a dimly lit lot 3 blocks away from the museum, avoiding the endless line of black luxury cars queuing for the valet. The Greenwich Modern Art Museum was a stark architectural triumph of glass and structural steel. It stood in sharp defiance of the heavy colonial mansions my parents idolized. Its transparent walls glowed against the freezing night sky, showcasing the vibrant life inside. I walked toward the entrance, pulling my coat tighter against the wind. Underneath the heavy canvas, I wore a simple, unbranded black dress. It was a deliberate choice. My mother spent her life draped in loud designer labels to broadcast her net worth. I preferred silence. I stepped through the revolving doors and surrendered my coat to the cloakroom attendant. The air inside the museum hummed with the synchronized clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the low modulated voices of the financial elite. I took a slow breath. My 2-ton bronze kinetic sculpture was hidden somewhere in the cavernous main hall under a velvet drape. My legally binding poison pill was locked in the Vanguard corporate files. The trap was fully armed. Now I just had to survive the psychological gauntlet of my own family. I did not have to search for them. They found me before I even reached the reception desk. My mother materialized from the crowd, wearing a beaded silver gown that caught the gallery lights. She grabbed my elbow with a grip that felt more like a shackle than an embrace. She leaned in, her perfume overpowering the crisp scent of the museum, and whispered that I looked tragically underdressed. My father flanked her right side, checking his platinum wristwatch as if my mere presence was throwing off his schedule. He offered a tight, closed-mouth smile, the kind of greeting reserved for disappointing business associates. Then Richard appeared. My uncle wore a custom tuxedo, tailored to project unquestionable authority. He held a glass of bourbon in his left hand, surveying the room like a feudal lord inspecting his newly conquered territory. He looked me up and down, offering a patronizing chuckle. He told his peers I had finally decided to rejoin civil society. Richard did not waste a single second. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder and physically guided me toward a cluster of older men standing near a modern art installation. I recognized them immediately. They were prominent Yale board members and senior partners at competing investment firms. Richard introduced me with loud, theatrical flair. He did not introduce me as a working sculptor. He introduced me as a cautionary tale. He told the men I was currently unemployed and struggling to find my footing after a misguided youth spent studying art. The men offered polite, uncomfortable nods, sipping their drinks while avoiding eye contact with me. Richard laughed, a booming sound designed to draw attention. He announced that he was stepping in to rescue me from my own bad decisions, referencing the administrative job he had offered at Thanksgiving. He framed himself as the benevolent patriarch, saving a hopeless relative from financial ruin. I stood perfectly still. I did not defend myself. I did not list my credentials or mention the anonymous 7-figure commission sitting 30 yards away. I simply held my sparkling water and observed his performance. The arrogance was blinding him. He was so focused on humiliating me that he failed to notice the museum curator giving me a subtle, respectful nod from across the room. The social suffocation continued for another 40 minutes. My parents shadowed my every move, ensuring I did not embarrass them. I eventually managed to slip away toward the rear of the hall under the pretense of refilling my glass. Near the service doors, I spotted a familiar face. It was David, the head catering manager for the museum. David and I had worked together during a smaller gallery exhibition 2 years prior. He was a pragmatic, efficient man who knew the logistical nightmare of moving heavy art installations. I approached him, keeping my voice low. We briefly discussed the reinforced flooring required for my bronze centerpiece and confirmed the dismantling schedule for the following week. It was a purely professional exchange between two people who handled the physical reality of the art world. David smiled, shook my hand, and disappeared back into the kitchens. When I turned around, Richard was standing 10 feet away. His face was flushed with triumph. He had watched my entire interaction with David from a distance. Because his ego filtered every scenario through a lens of superiority, he entirely misread the exchange. Richard walked over, his chest puffed out. He loudly asked if I was begging the kitchen staff for a waitressing shift. He assumed I was panicking about his 30-day trust fund deadline and desperately seeking minimum wage employment to survive. My mother hurried over, her face pale with horror at the thought of her daughter serving appetizers to her country club friends. She hissed at me to maintain some dignity. Richard waved his hand, dismissing her concern. He said it was a good sign. He claimed it showed I was finally facing the cold, hard reality of the economy. He patted my shoulder again, telling me not to worry about serving drinks because my new desk at his hedge fund was waiting. I looked into his eyes. I saw zero doubt. He was utterly convinced of his own narrative. His false assumptions cemented his complacency. He believed I was a broken, desperate girl. He had no idea he had just watched me dictate the logistical terms for $1 million asset. With his ego fully inflated by my supposed humiliation, Richard shifted his focus to his primary target. The host of the evening had just entered the main hall. Alara Vance was the regional director of the Vanguard Arts Group. She was an elegant, intimidating woman who handled temperamental artists and ruthless billionaires with equal precision. Tonight, she looked visibly strained. The pressure of the hostile corporate takeover was taking a toll on her posture. Richard spotted her near the VIP lounge entrance. His demeanor changed instantly, shifting from the mocking uncle to the corporate predator. He checked his watch and signaled to my father. The time for social pleasantries was over. It was time to close the acquisition. Richard turned to me, his smile dropping into a hard, determined line. He told me to follow him. He said I had spent enough time mingling with the hired help. He wanted me to watch how real power operated. He intended to drag me into the VIP lounge to witness the Vanguard director signing the preliminary acquisition agreement. He wanted an audience for his victory. He wanted me to see him purchase the very institution that I foolishly dreamed of joining. My mother flanked my left side, ensuring I could not slip away. We marched across the gleaming marble floor, a tight familial formation, moving toward the frosted glass doors of the private suite. I walked in step with them, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. I knew exactly what was waiting inside that room. The legal documents were drafted. The change of ownership clauses were hidden in the fine print. Richard was about to put his ink on paper and trigger the poison pill that would collapse his entire empire. I kept my face blank, stepping through the glass doors, ready to watch a Wall Street titan willingly walk off a cliff. The frosted glass doors of the VIP suite hissed shut behind us. The ambient noise of the gala vanished, replaced by the low hum of the climate control system and the tense breathing of the people inside the room. Richard unbuttoned his suit jacket with a theatrical flourish and took a seat across from Alara Vance. A thick stack of legal documents rested on the polished table between them. My father stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, projecting an aura of quiet dominance. My mother lingered near the door, keeping a watchful eye on me. I stood in the corner, holding my sparkling water, my face a mask of polite indifference. I looked at the crisp white pages sitting in front of the Vanguard director. I knew the architecture of those contracts better than the man preparing to sign them. Watching Richard reach for his monogrammed pen, my mind drifted back to a high-rise office in Manhattan a few days prior. Evelyn Carter did not build her reputation by playing nice. She was a senior partner at a firm that specialized in corporate intellectual property, a woman who treated contract law like a contact sport. Her office was a fortress of glass and steel overlooking the financial district. When I sat across from her and explained the Vanguard situation, she did not offer sympathy. She offered strategy. I told her about the hostile takeover. I explained that my uncle was attempting to acquire the holding company to cover his own leveraged debts. I needed a mechanism to ensure my life's work did not become a line item on his balance sheet. Evelyn pulled up my original Vanguard exhibition agreement on her monitor. She read through the clauses with the speed of a machine processing code. She leaned back in her ergonomic chair, steepling her fingers. She said standard contracts were porous. They allowed holding companies to transfer assets during mergers without consulting the creators. We needed to replace the porous language with solid armor. We needed a poison pill. I instructed her to draft a key artist provision. We spent hours refining the terminology until it was impenetrable. The terms were rigid and unyielding. If the Vanguard Arts Group underwent any change in corporate ownership without the explicit written consent of my limited liability company, my exhibition agreement became instantly void. There was no grace period. There was no negotiation window. The legal severance would be immediate. Furthermore, all artworks associated with my portfolio must be legally retracted from their galleries within 24 hours. Evelyn typed the addendum, her keystrokes echoing in the quiet office. She stopped and looked at me over the rim of her glasses. She noted that pulling my portfolio would not just protect my art, it would drain the blood from the Vanguard acquisition. The holding company derived its high valuation from exclusive contracts with premium creators. If the anchor artist vanished, the projected value of the gallery network dropped to zero. The acquiring firm would be purchasing a hollow shell burdened by immense operating costs. I nodded. That was the exact intention. I told Evelyn we needed one more layer of security, a fail-safe mechanism to ensure Richard could not manipulate the gallery ledgers after the fact. I demanded the insertion of a specific independent appraisal clause. The contract must state that any final transfer of my physical assets or valuation of my intellectual property required the authorization of a named independent appraiser. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. She asked for the name. I gave her the credentials of Dr. Miriam Rostova. She was a renowned art historian and appraiser based in Geneva, a woman who answered only to my company and despised Wall Street interference in the art world. Dr. Rostova was the gatekeeper. Without her signature, Vanguard could not claim my sculptures as assets on any financial disclosure. Richard would be legally paralyzed, unable to leverage my work to appease his creditors. It was a loaded gun hidden beneath layers of corporate jargon, waiting for the right moment to fire. Evelyn finalized the text. She printed the addendum and pushed it across the desk for my review. She watched me read the dense legal paragraphs. She remarked that she usually saw this level of clinical detachment in corporate raiders, not in independent sculptors. She said I possessed a chilling lack of emotional hesitation. She recognized the ruthless precision in my strategy. I signed the amendment without a tremor in my hand. I realized in that moment that I had inherited the Montgomery family trait. I possessed the same cold, calculating instinct that my father and uncle used to dismantle their competitors. The difference was the target. They used their ruthlessness to accumulate status. I was using mine to secure my freedom. I had weaponized their own tactics against them, turning my intellectual property into a financial landmine. The memory faded as the sharp sound of a throat clearing brought me back to the present. Inside the VIP suite, Richard was tapping his pen against the glass table. He looked at Alara Vance with an expression of supreme boredom. He told the Vanguard director that dragging out the inevitable was bad for business. He said his firm was offering a generous bailout for a failing enterprise, and she should be grateful he was willing to inherit her mess. Alara sat rigid in her chair. She was a brilliant woman caught in a terrible position. Her board of directors had panicked under the pressure of the hostile takeover, leaving her to finalize the surrender. She looked at the preliminary acquisition agreement. Her eyes scanned the summary pages, searching for a miracle that was not there. She did not know about the revised key artist addendum filed deep in the Vanguard legal archives. The trap was perfectly concealed. Richard leaned forward, his arrogance filling the room. He told Alara to sign the document so they could all return to the party and celebrate a profitable future. My mother smiled from the doorway, radiating pride at her brother's display of dominance. My father checked his watch again, irritated by the delay. I watched Alara pick up her pen. The tension in the suite was a physical weight. If she refused to sign, the takeover stalled, and Richard might have time to discover the poison pill before he committed his capital. The trap required his blind participation. He had to execute the agreement believing he held all the leverage. I needed him to step onto the trigger. I took a slow sip of my water, my eyes fixed on the tip of his monogrammed pen. The entire Montgomery legacy rested on a single signature, and the man holding the ink had no idea he was writing his own ending. The air in the VIP suite felt thick, practically vibrating with the collective greed of my family. Alara Vance held the Montblanc pen a fraction of an inch above the preliminary acquisition agreement. Her hand was perfectly steady, but the slight tightening of her jaw betrayed her reluctance. She was a woman cornered by leverage. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, radiating the smug satisfaction of a predator who had successfully trapped his prey. My mother watched from the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her beaded gown. She looked at Richard with pure reverence. Then her gaze flicked to me, her expression instantly hardening into a mask of maternal disappointment. Seeing that look transported me back to the exact moment the heavy, gold-embossed envelope had arrived at my foundry. The memory was sharp. The private courier had walked into my workspace, his polished shoes crunching on the stray metal shavings scattered across the concrete. He handed me the thick vellum envelope. The Montgomery family crest was pressed into the wax seal. I remembered breaking the seal with a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters. Inside was the formal invitation to the Greenwich Modern Art Gala. Clipped to the thick cardstock was a piece of personalized stationery. The handwriting was sharp and angled. It belonged to my mother. My mother navigated life through the lens of social currency. She viewed her children not as people, but as extensions of her own brand. Preston, the orthopedic surgeon, was her pristine showcase. I was the defective merchandise she had to constantly explain away. Her note was brief, but calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage. She wrote that Richard had purchased a premium VIP table for the family. She demanded I attend as their guest. The final sentence was underlined twice. She wrote that it was time for me to observe what real wealth and success looked like, instead of hiding in a dirty warehouse playing with scrap metal. Standing in the foundry with that note, I had realized the true nature of the invitation. It was a velvet summons. It was not an educational exercise. It was a planned humiliation. I knew Richard intended to use the gala's private VIP lounge to force the Vanguard director into signing the corporate takeover. He wanted to execute his power play surrounded by his cheering family. By attending, I would be stepping directly into the lion's den. I would be forced to endure their psychological abuse, their patronizing smiles, and their endless lectures, all while secretly guarding the very assets they were attempting to steal. I had stood in the center of my studio looking at the towering bronze sculpture cooling in the shadows. The easiest choice would have been to decline the invitation. I could have stayed in New Haven, safe behind my steel doors, and let the lawyers handle the fallout. Retreating was not in my nature. I weld structural supports designed to hold thousands of pounds of pressure. I know how to bear weight. I decided to accept the velvet summons. I needed to look Richard in the eye while he signed his own financial death warrant. The preparation for the gala had required forging a different kind of armor. My family worshipped flashy designer labels. They used expensive brands as a shield to deflect criticism and assert their dominance. I refused to play their game. I walked to my small office closet and selected a simple, unbranded black dress. The fabric was high quality, but devoid of any recognizable logos or ostentatious embellishments. It was a deliberate rejection of their entire value system. When I put the dress on, the dark fabric created a stark contrast with the pale burn scars and calluses on my arms and hands. I did not try to hide the marks of my labor with makeup or long gloves. I wore them as proof of my independence. I had looked in the mirror and promised myself that my icy composure would hold under the weight of their public mockery. I would be the quiet observer. I would let them talk. The sound of paper rustling snapped my focus back to the present reality of the VIP suite. Alara Vance lowered the pen. She signed her name on the bottom line of the preliminary acquisition agreement. The signature was fluid and dark. Richard did not smile right away. He waited until she pushed the document across the glass table. He picked up his own pen, the gold trim catching the overhead lights. He signed his name next to hers with a rapid, practiced flourish. The deal was struck. The hostile takeover was officially initiated. My father let out a quiet breath of approval from his position near the window. My mother beamed, stepping forward to offer Richard a congratulatory pat on the shoulder. They believed the Montgomery legacy had just expanded, securing their financial dominance for another generation. They did not know that Richard's signature had just activated the key artist poison pill hidden deep within the Vanguard legal archives. By signing that paper without the consent of my limited liability company, he had instantly voided my exhibition contract. He had legally authorized the retraction of my portfolio and the collapse of the gallery's valuation. Richard stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He looked down at Alara. He told her his transition team would be in her office on Monday morning to begin auditing the inventory. Alara stood up, her posture rigid, and walked out of the suite without saying a word. Richard turned to me. His eyes were bright with adrenaline. He asked if I was taking notes. He said that was how a real professional secured their future. He told me to remember this moment the next time I was covered in grease pretending to be a visionary. I kept my face perfectly still. I offered a slow, measured nod. I told him it was a very educational experience. My mother clapped her hands together, breaking the tension. She announced that it was time to rejoin the party. She wanted to parade her victorious brother around the main hall. She linked her arm through mine, her grip tight and unyielding. We walked out of the VIP suite and back into the blinding lights of the gala. The public mockery escalated the moment we stepped onto the main floor. Richard was emboldened by his perceived victory. He gathered a new audience of wealth managers and corporate board members. He pointed at me using his empty scotch glass as a baton. He loudly recounted the story of my failed art career to a group of men who nodded with polite indifference. He told them I was a prime example of what happens when a prestigious university indulges in practical dreams. My mother stood beside me, offering tragic sighs and murmuring about the difficulties of raising a stubborn child. The psychological pressure was intense. Every instinct urged me to walk away, to leave the museum and drive back to the quiet sanctuary of my foundry. But my icy composure held. I stood tall in my simple black dress. I let the insults wash over me. I watched the faces of the men laughing at Richard's jokes, cataloging their features. In less than an hour, the truth would shatter their smug superiority. The low murmur of the crowd was suddenly interrupted by a sharp, melodic chime. A museum curator was tapping a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute. The sound echoed through the cavernous space, drawing the attention of the 300 guests. The curator stood near the massive velvet drape covering my centerpiece. She smiled warmly and announced that the host of the evening was ready to present the exhibition. Richard nudged my arm. He told me to pay close attention to the unveiling. He wanted me to see the kind of high-value assets his new company owned. He wanted me to look at a true masterpiece and realize how small and insignificant my own efforts were. I turned my head to look at him. I gave him a small, polite smile. I told him I would not miss it for the world. We moved with the crowd toward the center of the hall, closing the distance between the Montgomery family and the brass plaque bolted to the marble floor. The final act was about to begin. The migration toward the center of the exhibition hall felt less like a celebration and more like a carefully choreographed corporate march. The Greenwich Modern Art Museum provided a brilliant visual contrast to the dark, oppressive colonial mansion where I endured Thanksgiving dinner. The Montgomery estate was a tomb of dark mahogany, heavy tapestries, and inherited shadows. In stark opposition, the museum was a marvel of sweeping glass, exposed steel beams, and pristine minimalist opulence. It was a cathedral built to showcase modern wealth, illuminated by sharp white spotlights that left no room for secrets to hide. As we navigated through the sea of guests, my mother tightened her grip on my elbow. Her manicured fingernails dug into the fabric of my dress. She physically guided me through the crowd, steering me around prominent figures as if I were a lost, wayward child prone to wandering off. The gesture was designed to project maternal control, but it felt like a shackle. I matched her pace, offering nothing but a serene, blank expression. The air around us hummed with the distinct soundscape of Connecticut high society. It was a symphony composed of clinking crystal champagne flutes and the low, modulated murmurs of the financial elite. These were people who dictated market trends and shaped economic policies before their morning coffee. They spoke in hushed, measured tones, exchanging insider information disguised as casual gossip. Our progression toward the veiled centerpiece was abruptly halted. Richard spotted a tight circle of older, distinguished men standing near a geometric steel installation. His eyes lit up with the predatory hunger of a man recognizing his equals. He adjusted his silk tie and steered our family directly toward them. These were not just casual investors. They were the apex predators of the regional economy. They were prominent Yale donors, managing partners at legacy law firms, and retired pharmaceutical executives. In this fiercely competitive subculture, true success was strictly defined by lucrative careers in law, medicine, or Wall Street finance. An Ivy League pedigree was expected to yield a corner office or a surgical residency. Within their rigid hierarchy, the pursuit of an art degree was harshly ridiculed as a frivolous, useless hobby reserved for naive dreamers who lacked the discipline for real work. Richard approached the circle with his arms spread wide, projecting the overwhelming confidence of a man who had just conquered a corporate empire in the VIP suite. The men turned to greet him, offering firm handshakes and deferential nods. They congratulated him on the Vanguard acquisition, their voices thick with professional envy. Richard soaked in their admiration, his ego expanding to fill the pristine space. Then he placed his hand on my shoulder and pulled me forward. He introduced me to the group with a booming theatrical voice. He did not present me as his niece. He presented me as a tragic cautionary tale. He told the men that I was the black sheep of the Montgomery lineage, a girl who had squandered a world-class education on a useless fine arts program. He laughed a dry scraping sound and told them I was currently navigating the harsh realities of unemployment. The Yale donors looked at me with a mixture of pity and polite disdain. One of the retired executives, a man with silver hair and a sharp-tailored suit, offered a patronizing smile. He remarked that the younger generation often needed a few years of struggle to understand the value of a solid corporate foundation. Richard enthusiastically agreed. He framed himself as the benevolent patriarch, boasting that he was personally staging an intervention. He loudly informed the circle of power brokers that he had offered me an entry-level administrative position at his hedge fund. He said it was the only way to teach me discipline and salvage my future before I became a permanent financial burden on my parents. My father stood slightly behind Richard, nodding in solemn agreement. My mother sighed, touching her pearls, playing the role of the long-suffering matriarch, doing her best to manage a disappointing child. They were using my supposed failure as a prop to elevate their own status. They wanted to prove that even when the Montgomery family produced a defect, they possessed the ruthless efficiency to correct it. I endured the public humiliation without breaking my polite facade. I did not shrink away from the Yale donors. I did not lower my gaze. I looked directly into the eyes of the silver-haired executive, my expression remaining neutral and unreadable. I held my glass of sparkling water in my right hand. I did not grip the fragile crystal with the delicate touch expected at a high society gala. I gripped it with the exact same calloused, steady pressure I used to operate a heavy tungsten grinder in my foundry. My hands knew how to control volatile force. They knew how to guide a plasma cutter through an inch of solid steel without trembling. I channeled that physical memory into the present moment. I contained my frustration, locking it away behind a wall of pure operational focus. I watched Richard preen under the approving gaze of his peers. He was drunk on his own perceived superiority, thoroughly convinced that he held my entire existence in the palm of his hand. He believed the narrative he was spinning. He thought the silence I offered was submission. He had no concept of the structural trap waiting beneath his feet. The conversation shifted away from my alleged unemployment and returned to the Vanguard acquisition. Richard boasted about the streamlined efficiency he planned to bring to the holding company. He talked about stripping away the emotional volatility of the art world and applying rigorous mathematical logic to the gallery ledgers. He was bragging about reorganizing a kingdom that had just legally evaporated the moment he signed the paperwork. The museum curator stepped up to a sleek podium positioned near the velvet drape. She tapped the microphone, a sharp electronic hum cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. The Yale donors turned their attention toward the center of the hall. Richard offered one final boastful remark to his colleagues, promising them a private tour of his newly acquired assets later in the week. He turned back to me, offering a condescending wink. He told me to watch the presentation closely. He wanted me to learn how true value was measured in the real economy. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. The breaking point was rapidly approaching. Richard had pushed his arrogance to the absolute limit, building a towering monument to his own ego. The new conflict was no longer about enduring his insults. The conflict was the imminent collision between his manufactured reality and the heavy bronze truth hidden under that drape. I stepped forward, falling into line beside my mother, as the crowd settled into a breathless, expectant silence. The curator stepped away from the microphone to confer with the audio technicians. The brief delay provided a window of opportunity. I slipped away from the tight circle of Yale donors moving toward the shadowed perimeter of the exhibition hall. I needed to confirm the structural supports beneath the velvet drape. A bronze assembly of that scale requires precise weight distribution to prevent cracking the imported marble flooring. I found the head of museum logistics standing near the service corridor. His name was Thomas. He wore a plain dark suit and a discreet earpiece holding a digital tablet that tracked the evening schedule. Thomas was a pragmatist. We had spent the previous morning coordinating the reinforced flatbed delivery and calculating the floor load capacities. I approached him to verify the dismantling timeline for the following week. We spoke in quiet, measured tones, discussing freight elevators and securing the kinetic joints for transport. It was a brief professional exchange, centered entirely on physics and raw materials. Thomas nodded, tapped a confirmation onto his screen, and disappeared through the service doors. I turned around and found Richard staring at me from across the room. He was standing next to my parents, holding his scotch glass. A wide, predatory grin stretched across his face. He nudged my father and pointed in my direction. He threw his head back and let out a loud, barking laugh. The sound pierced the refined murmur of the gala. Richard did not see a sculptor consulting with a logistics director. His ego filtered the entire world through a strict hierarchy of wealth and servitude. He saw me wearing a plain black dress, whispering to a man who looked like an event supervisor near the kitchen doors. His mind instantly constructed a narrative that fed his own superiority. He assumed I was begging for a minimum wage job. He believed the 30-day deadline he issued in the family library had broken my resolve. In his mind, I was desperately trying to secure a waitressing shift or a coat check position to survive the impending loss of my trust fund. He marched across the polished floor, leaving my parents behind. He closed the distance between us with the confident stride of a conquering general. He stopped a few inches away, invading my personal space. He reached out and patted my shoulder. His hand felt heavy and patronizing. He told me it was refreshing to see me finally facing the real economy. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of mock sympathy. He said there was no shame in honest manual labor, provided I remembered the administrative desk waiting for me at his firm. He suggested I could serve appetizers on the weekends to supplement my entry-level corporate salary. I looked at the smug satisfaction radiating from his eyes. His assumption was a masterclass in blind arrogance. By convincing himself that I was a defeated beggar, he cemented his own complacency. He stripped away any residual caution he might have harbored. I offered a slow, deferential nod. I told him I was just trying to secure my logistics for the coming month. The word logistics flew right over his head. He interpreted it as scheduling shifts. He chuckled, took a sip of his drink, and told me to keep up the good work. He turned his back on me, his confidence swelling to a dangerous peak. Inflated by his perceived victory over his niece Richard, pivoted his attention to his primary target. Alara Vance was standing near a glass partition, reviewing the guest manifest on a clipboard. The Vanguard director looked exhausted. The ink on the preliminary acquisition agreement was barely dry, but Richard was not content to wait for the ink to cure. He wanted to assert his dominance over the newly acquired territory. He cornered her against the glass. He planted his hand on the partition, physically blocking her exit path. I stayed near the service doors, close enough to hear the exchange but far enough to blend into the shadows. Richard started dictating his vision for the holding company. He spoke with the rapid-fire delivery of a day trader. He told Alara the era of indulging temperamental creators was over. He criticized the gallery ledgers, claiming the financial margins were too dependent on the unpredictable moods of visionaries. He used the word visionary as a slur. Alara tightened her grip on her clipboard. She maintained her professional poise, but her eyes betrayed a deep, simmering resentment. She tried to explain that the value of the holding company resided in the unique talent of its roster. She said securing exclusive output required a delicate touch. Richard waved his hand, dismissing her expertise. He praised the hard, unyielding logic of hedge fund management. He said assets were simply numbers on a spreadsheet. He declared his intention to streamline the gallery operations, cut the dead weight, and force the remaining artists to double their production quotas to satisfy his investors. He viewed the bronze sculptures, the oil paintings, and the conceptual installations as mere commodities to be traded, stripped, and sold. He casually diminished the emotional volatility of the art world. He said he would bring discipline to a chaotic industry. I stood in the periphery, tracking every financial misstep and every arrogant assumption falling from his lips. He was laying out a business model designed to alienate the very people who generated the wealth he sought to control. He profoundly underestimated the assets he believed he was effortlessly acquiring. He assumed contracts were ironclad cages that bound creators to his will. He did not realize that the creators held the keys to the cages. By insulting the artists to the face of the gallery director, he proved his fundamental ignorance of the market he was attempting to dominate. He did not understand that intellectual property requires willing participation. He thought he could bully a sculptor the same way he bullied a failing real estate developer. The tension in the air grew thick and heavy. I watched Alara absorb his insults. She was bound by the corporate takeover, forced to nod and listen to a man who knew nothing about her life work. I felt a surge of cold, calculating focus. Richard was expanding his chest, boasting about his flawless strategic vision. He was entirely blind to the details of the documents he had signed an hour earlier. He was ignorant of the key artist provision lying dormant in the Vanguard files. He pushed his face closer to Alara. He told her the upcoming exhibition would be the last event run under the old rules. He said starting Monday, Vanguard belonged to him, and he expected total submission from her and her roster. My phone vibrated silently in my dress pocket. It was a text message from my lead attorney in Manhattan, a single word confirming that the poison pill documentation was secured and authenticated by the independent appraiser in Geneva. The financial landmine was primed. Richard stepped back from the glass partition, satisfied that he had established his new world order. He adjusted his cuffs and turned toward the center of the hall, ready to inspect the evening centerpiece. The microphone near the velvet drape crackled to life. The curator returned to the podium, her voice ringing out over the speakers, calling the guests to gather for the main event. Richard looked over his shoulder and caught my eye. He gave a sharp nod, signaling me to follow him. He wanted his defeated niece to witness the spoils of his victory. I stepped out of the shadows and fell into step behind him. The pieces were perfectly aligned. The trap was hidden in plain sight. I walked toward the towering draped figure, waiting to see if a Wall Street titan could survive the collision with a bronze reality. The curator's voice echoed over the museum speakers, a clear, melodic chime, requesting the guests to gather in the center of the hall. The presentation of the anchor piece was imminent. Richard stopped walking. He held up a hand, signaling my parents to halt their progression toward the main floor. He turned his attention back to Alara Vance, who was attempting to navigate her way toward the presentation podium. Richard stepped deliberately into her path, blocking her exit. He informed the Vanguard director that the public unveiling could wait 5 more minutes. He pointed to a legal courier standing near the cloakroom. The courier held a thick, leather-bound portfolio. Richard announced that the final master agreements had just arrived from his legal team. He wanted the ink dry on the binding contracts before she unveiled a single piece of art. He needed the absolute certainty of ownership before he allowed the public to view his new property. Richard reached out and grabbed my upper arm. His grip was tight, a physical manifestation of his assumed authority over my life. He told me I was coming with him. He said my supposed search for a waitressing job could be paused. He wanted me to witness a high-level financial transaction firsthand. He intended to burn the image of his corporate victory into my mind, using his success to highlight my apparent failure. He dragged me toward the frosted glass doors of the semi-private VIP lounge overlooking the main gallery. My mother and father followed close behind, their faces glowing with anticipated pride. They were eager to participate in the ritual of wealth accumulation. The transition into the VIP lounge was jarring. The heavy glass doors hissed shut instantly, severing the ambient noise of the gala. The room was perfectly soundproofed. It smelled of expensive leather seating and the sterile, filtered air of modern corporate architecture. A long, transparent glass table dominated the center of the space. Alara entered the room with visible reluctance. The courier placed the heavy portfolio on the table, nodded respectfully, and exited the suite. The document contained hundreds of pages of dense corporate legalese. It outlined the complete transfer of the Vanguard Arts Group holding company to Richard's hedge fund. Buried deep within those crisp white pages, hidden beneath layers of standard merger terminology, was the key artist addendum my Manhattan attorney had filed. It was the poison pill resting silently on the table. Richard stood at the head of the glass table. He refused to sit down. He wanted to tower over the Vanguard director and project total dominance. He delivered a monologue about the nature of power. He told Alara that the art world operated on fragile illusions, but Wall Street operated on solid leverage. He claimed he was bringing necessary discipline to a chaotic and unprofitable network. He spoke about liquidating underperforming galleries and doubling the production quotas of the remaining creators. My mother smoothed her silver-beaded gown and whispered to my father about the upcoming country club newsletters. They were already calculating the social dividends of Richard acquiring such a prestigious cultural institution. They viewed his triumph as an extension of their own status. They looked at me with expressions of deep pity. They assumed I was overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the wealth changing hands in front of me. They thought I was finally realizing the worthless nature of my industrial labor. I stood near the door, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I focused my eyes on the thick stack of paper resting on the glass. I recognized the specific blue binding tab used by my legal counsel poking out from the center of the stack. The trap was sitting right in front of him. The financial landmine was armed and ready. Alara looked at the master agreement. She looked utterly exhausted. The relentless pressure of the hostile takeover had drained her resources and backed her board of directors into a corner. She did not know about my specific contract amendment. She only knew she was surrendering her life work to a corporate raider who despised the very assets he was buying. She reached into her tailored blazer, pulled out a simple black pen, and signed the bottom of the executive summary. She pushed the heavy portfolio across the smooth, transparent surface toward my uncle. Richard laughed. It was a harsh, grating sound that bounced off the soundproof walls. He told her she was making the smartest decision of her career by stepping aside. He reached into his breast pocket and retrieved his monogrammed fountain pen. The gold casing gleamed under the recessed ceiling lights. He did not open the portfolio to read the fine print. He did not consult his compliance counsel. Valerie had conveniently decided to skip the gala, leaving Richard entirely isolated from objective legal advice. Richard believed his own narrative of invincibility. He assumed the documents were a mere formality, a simple transfer of assets from a weaker entity to a stronger one. He thought reading the details was a task meant for subordinates. His blinding arrogance had caused him to ignore the basic rules of corporate acquisition. He believed he held all the leverage, making him careless. Richard looked at me before he put the pen to the paper. He told me to pay close attention to his next movement. He said this was how the world truly worked. He claimed that visionary talent was entirely worthless without the capital to control and monetize it. He wanted me to learn that people with money always owned the people with ideas. He was trying to crush my spirit one final time before the 30-day trust fund deadline expired. I did not blink. I maintained my icy composure. I offered a slow, measured nod. I told him I was watching very closely. He smiled, deeply satisfied with my apparent submission. He uncapped his fountain pen. He pressed the sharp nib against the thick parchment. I watched the dark ink flow from the gold tip, forming his signature on the dotted line. The physical act took less than 3 seconds. The legal ramifications were instantaneous and catastrophic. By executing that final signature, Richard triggered the key artist poison pill. He officially acquired the Vanguard Arts Group without securing the explicit written consent of my limited liability company. That single unread clause instantly voided my long-term exhibition contract. It legally mandated the immediate retraction of my entire portfolio from their gallery network. Richard believed he had just purchased a global art empire. In reality, he had just purchased a hollow shell. Without my anchor contracts and my future commissions, the projected valuation of the holding company plummeted to zero. His hedge fund was already over-leveraged and bleeding capital. The massive debt he took on to finance this hostile takeover would now crush his firm entirely. The acquisition was legally toxic. He had effectively bankrupted himself with a single stroke of his pen. Richard capped his fountain pen and slid it back into his pocket. He stood up straight, inflating his chest. He looked around the room, believing he was a king. He surveyed his new domain through the glass walls of the VIP lounge. He looked out at the wealthy guests, the tuxedoed waiters, and the covered masterpiece in the center of the hall. He thought he owned every single piece of it. My parents stepped forward to congratulate him. My father shook his hand vigorously, praising his ruthless business acumen. My mother kissed his cheek, telling him he had secured the Montgomery legacy for another century. They celebrated their ultimate victory standing together in a soundproof room, entirely unaware that the floor had just dropped out from underneath them. I kept my hands folded in front of me. The dark amusement inside my chest was a cold, steady flame. The crown rested firmly on his head, but the listener knows it was already turning to ash. I had structurally dismantled a Wall Street titan using the very intellectual property he mocked. Alara Vance gathered her copy of the signed agreement. She did not offer a congratulatory handshake. She walked past Richard and opened the heavy glass door leading back to the main hall. She told him the public unveiling was about to commence and the guests were waiting for the new owner to make his appearance. Richard adjusted his silk tie. He gestured for my parents to lead the way out of the lounge. He turned to me one last time. He said he hoped the lesson sank in. He told me to fetch his coat from the cloakroom after the presentation, just to get some practice for my new administrative role. I followed him out of the suite. The transition from the quiet glass room to the echoing exhibition hall felt electric. The crowd had formed a tight circle around the velvet drape. The museum spotlights were focused squarely on the hidden bronze structure. The moment of revelation had arrived. Richard marched toward the front row, eager to inspect his newly acquired property. He was walking directly toward the heavy brass plaque bolted to the marble floor. The final collision between his ego and my reality was waiting for him under the bright museum lights. The transition out of the soundproof suite felt like stepping onto a theatrical stage. The Greenwich Museum floor was packed shoulder to shoulder with Connecticut high society. Waiters carrying silver trays wove through the guests, collecting empty champagne flutes to ensure absolute silence for the presentation. Richard led our familial procession. He moved with the entitlement of a conqueror parting the sea of tuxedos and beaded gowns. My parents followed in his wake, their chins held high, borrowing his newly minted authority. I walked a few paces behind them, maintaining my measured stride. At the center of the exhibition space stood a towering structure draped in heavy, dark velvet. The fabric absorbed the overhead spotlights, creating a sharp silhouette against the polished marble floor. A sleek acrylic podium was positioned a few feet away. Alara Vance stood behind the microphone. She looked pale. The vibrant energy she typically brought to these cultural events was entirely drained, replaced by the grim posture of a hostage forced to read a ransom demand. She had spent 2 decades building vanguard arts from a boutique gallery into a global sanctuary for visionary creators. Tonight, she was presiding over its surrender to a man who viewed her life work as a taxable liability. Alara adjusted the microphone. The sharp feedback loop cut through the low murmurs, commanding instant attention. 300 pairs of eyes focused on the podium. Richard stopped in the very front row, planting his feet firmly behind the braided stanchion. He pulled me up to stand directly beside him, ensuring I had an unobstructed view of the asset he believed he now controlled. Alara cleared her throat. She began her speech by welcoming the board members, the prominent donors, and the private collectors. Her voice trembled slightly on the opening syllables, but quickly stabilized. She pivoted the topic away from the corporate transition and focused entirely on the art. She told the audience they were about to witness the debut of a generational talent. She described the creator as an anonymous visionary. She explained that the individual behind the draped fabric did not court media attention or attend high society dinners. The creator preferred to speak exclusively through raw industrial materials. Alara spoke about the grueling physical toll required to manipulate structural bronze and carbon steel. She detailed the mastery of thermodynamics, weight distribution, and mechanical engineering necessary to bring the centerpiece to life. I stood motionless, listening to my own professional eulogy. It was a surreal experience. Alara was describing my calloused hands, my solitary late nights in the New Haven foundry, and my relentless dedication to the craft. She was validating every single choice my family had spent years mocking. My mother leaned close to my father, whispering a complaint about the length of the introduction. They had zero interest in the artistic process. They only cared about the price tag. Richard shifted his weight, checking his platinum watch. He viewed Alara's passionate speech as unnecessary filler, delaying the inspection of his property. Alara reached the climax of her presentation. She revealed the financial statistics. She announced that the kinetic sculpture, hidden beneath the velvet, had already secured a private valuation of $2.5 million. It was the highest appraisal for a debut piece in the history of the holding company. A ripple of genuine shock washed over the crowd. The Yale donors and the hedge fund managers exchanged rapid, calculated glances. The number commanded their immediate respect. In their world, a high valuation was the only metric that truly mattered. $2.5 million elevated the sculpture from a cultural curiosity to a premium blue-chip asset. Richard straightened his posture. The boredom vanished from his eyes, replaced by a sharp, predatory gleam. He mentally added the figure to his corporate balance sheet. He nudged my elbow, a hard-pointed gesture. He murmured that the staggering figure was the true definition of a successful investment. He was already calculating the liquidation value of the metal. Alara stepped back from the acrylic podium. She gestured toward the ceiling. Two museum technicians positioned on the catwalk above released the suspension cables. The dark velvet drape fell away, collapsing onto the marble floor with a heavy, soft thud. The crowd gasped. The sound was uniform and involuntary. The kinetic bronze sculpture stood 18 feet tall, catching the sharp crossbeams of the gallery spotlights. It was a breathtaking collision of industrial grit and elegant fluidity. The structure consisted of sweeping metallic arcs and interlocking gears balanced with such terrifying precision that the ambient air currents in the room set the entire assembly into motion. The moving joints emitted a low, rhythmic mechanical hum, a sound that resonated deep within the chest. The heat marks from my plasma cutter were intentionally left visible along the primary welds, serving as a signature of the brutal labor required to forge the piece. It was not just a statue. It was a living, breathing engine of copper and tin. It demanded attention. The financial elite of Connecticut stared in silence. The men who spent their lives dissecting profit margins and exploiting corporate weaknesses were momentarily paralyzed by the sheer physical dominance of the engineering. They could not quantify the emotional depth radiating from the shifting metal, but they recognized the undeniable power of the construction. My parents stared at the structure. My father blinked, momentarily stripped of his usual cynical armor. My mother raised a hand to her collarbone, captivated by the slow-turning gears reflecting the bright overhead lights. For a brief, fleeting second, they experienced pure, unadulterated awe. They were looking directly at my soul, rendered in fire and steel, though they lacked the capacity to recognize it. Richard did not feel awe. Richard felt ownership. He leaned toward me, invading my personal space. The scent of aged scotch and expensive cologne washed over my face. He kept his eyes locked on the rotating bronze arcs. His expression was twisted into a smug, self-satisfied grin. He believed he was the ultimate victor. He believed his signature on the acquisition document had granted him dominion over the creator's genius. He lowered his voice to a patronizing whisper, ensuring only I could hear the insult. He told me to take notes. He said that towering structure was what real talent looked like. He compared the $2.5 million valuation to the scrap metal he assumed I played with in my dirty warehouse. He told me to study the craftsmanship and realize how far out of my depth I truly was. Then he delivered the final crushing blow he had been saving all evening. He smiled, his teeth gleaming in the spotlight. He said he was going to own the genius who built that machine. He bragged that by Monday morning, the anonymous creator would answer to his hedge fund, producing assets strictly to pad his bottom line. The dramatic irony hit its peak. The pressure in the room condensed into a singular, razor-sharp point. I did not flinch. I did not break my polite, serene facade. I turned my head and looked directly into my uncle's eyes. I saw the unyielding arrogance that had defined his entire existence. I saw a man who had built his fortune by exploiting the blind spots of others, entirely unaware of the blind spot he was currently standing in. I offered a slow, acknowledging nod. I agreed with his assessment. I told him the craftsmanship was indeed exceptional. Richard chuckled, satisfied that he had finally broken my spirit and forced me to recognize my own inferiority. He turned his attention away from me and looked down at the floor. He wanted to know the name of his new employee. He wanted to read the identity of the visionary he had just legally bound to his failing firm. He took a confident step forward, stepping over the velvet boundary rope. He lowered his gaze toward the heavy brass plaque bolted into the white marble base. The gallery lights reflected off the engraved lettering. The truth was sitting right there, cast in permanent dark metal, waiting to shatter his manufactured reality. I watched his eyes track the characters. The silence in the exhibition hall stretched tight and brittle, ready to snap. The applause from the gallery guests swelled, echoing off the high glass ceilings. It was a wave of cultured approval, the kind of polite but intense validation reserved only for things carrying a 7-figure price tag. The velvet rope separating the audience from the kinetic centerpiece seemed to bend under the collective anticipation. The elite of Connecticut surged forward. They were driven by a singular, unified desire to attach a human identity to the mechanical marvel standing before them. They wanted a name to write on their investment ledgers. Richard did not merely walk with the crowd. He waded through it. He used his broad shoulders to carve a path toward the front, acting as though the museum floor belonged to him by divine right. He was eager to inspect the crown jewel of his newly acquired portfolio. In his mind, he had already cataloged the bronze structure as collateral for his failing hedge fund. He motioned for my parents to follow closely in his wake. My mother hurried her steps, her beaded gown shimmering under the gallery lights, desperate to maintain her position in the orbit of her brother's manufactured success. My father kept a rigid, upright posture, his eyes fixed on the towering metal arcs, likely calculating the tax implications of such a high-value asset. I remained a few paces behind them, letting the distance grow. I allowed the social current to carry me forward at a natural, unhurried pace. Richard reached the braided velvet boundary. He planted his custom leather shoes on the white marble flooring, positioning himself dead center in front of the sculpture. The rhythmic, mechanical hum of the moving gears washed over him. The heat marks left by my welding torch were visible just above his eye level, a permanent record of the grueling physical labor he had spent years mocking. He did not care about the labor. He only cared about the ownership. He lowered his gaze toward the base of the installation. A heavy brass plaque was bolted directly into the stone. The metal was polished to a mirror finish, catching the glare of the overhead spotlights. The typography was unadorned and stark. There were no elaborate descriptions or lengthy artistic statements. There was only the title of the piece, the medium, the year of completion, and the name of the creator. Richard squinted. The harsh gallery lighting cast a sharp reflection across the brass, obscuring the letters for a fraction of a second. He leaned closer, tilting his head to bypass the glare. He was anticipating a European moniker, or the branding of a trendy, obscure design collective. He was expecting an entity he could intimidate, manipulate, and ultimately control. He read the first name, Florence. His brow furrowed. I watched his facial muscles contract from my vantage point a few feet away. A minor ripple of confusion disrupted his arrogant facade. Florence was a common enough name. It was an anomaly, a strange coincidence, that the visionary he had just claimed to own shared a first name with the niece he had just spent the entire evening humiliating. He likely assumed it was a trick of probability, a funny story he could tell his golfing partners later that week. He read the last name, Montgomery. The human brain is a remarkable engine for preserving its own reality. When presented with data that contradicts a foundational belief, the mind will often reject the information entirely before it accepts the paradigm shift. Richard had built his entire identity around the concept that he was the apex predator of his family and his industry. He had categorized me as a lazy, defective dependent. His cognitive architecture required me to be a failure so he could feel like a success. Looking down at the brass plate, his brain misfired. He read the letters again. He processed the spaces, the curves of the engraving, and the undeniable permanence of the text. Florence Montgomery. The psychological shock manifested physically. It was not a subtle shift in posture. Richard actually took a full, stumbling step backward. His heel caught the edge of the braided stanchion, causing the velvet rope to sway. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly shade of gray. His hand, still clutching the crystal glass of aged scotch, began to shake with the exact same tremor I had diagnosed in the family library on Thanksgiving night. The scotch sloshed against the rim, nearly spilling onto his tailored tuxedo trousers. He blinked rapidly. He was trying to force his eyes to correct the error. He wanted the brass to change. He needed the metal to align with the narrative he had written for himself inside the soundproof VIP lounge. But the bronze was unyielding. The text was legally binding. It was a permanent, undeniable testament to my labor and my independence. The narrative of the evening seemed to slow to a crawl. The surrounding noise of the gala faded into a distant, muffled hum. The only sound that mattered was the steady, rhythmic turning of the mechanical gears above our heads, a heartbeat of iron and tin. My parents caught up to the boundary line. They noticed Richard's sudden physical retreat. My mother reached out, placing a concerned hand on his arm, asking if he felt unwell. She followed his frozen gaze downward. She looked at the plaque. Her reaction was a study in profound systemic collapse. My mother had spent her entire adult life curating an image of effortless superiority. She had treated my Yale art degree as a shameful secret, a stain on the pristine fabric of her social standing. Reading her daughter's name engraved on a $2.5 million masterpiece short-circuited her operating system. Her manicured hand flew to her throat, her fingers finding the familiar cold comfort of her pearl necklace. Her mouth parted in a silent gasp. She looked from the brass plate up to the towering kinetic structure, unable to bridge the gap between the daughter she despised and the genius the entire room was currently worshiping. My father stepped beside her. He read the text. The cynical armor he wore like a second skin cracked down the middle. He was a man who only respected high-yield dividends and ruthless ambition. He stared at the name, realizing that the most valuable asset in the entire Montgomery lineage had been forged in a dirty New Haven warehouse he had refused to ever visit. His jaw tightened. He had no protocol for this situation. There was no country club etiquette guide for discovering you had spent years trying to financially starve a millionaire. The crumbling cognitive dissonance of my family was on full display. They were trapped in a paradox of their own making. They were surrounded by their wealthy peers, the very people they had just bragged to about cutting off my trust fund. Now those same peers were applauding my creation. I stepped out of the shadow of the crowd. I moved with slow, deliberate intent, closing the final few feet between us. I did not rush. I did not break my stride. I stepped up directly beside my uncle. I did not look down at the plaque. I knew every curve of the engraved lettering. I had authorized the typography myself. Instead, I raised my left hand and calmly adjusted the cuff of my simple, unbranded black dress. It was a quiet, grounded movement, a physical reminder of my own steady pulse in the center of their escalating panic. I turned my head and looked directly into Richard's eyes. The silence between us was deafening. It was a heavy, pressurized void that drowned out the applause and the clinking glasses of the surrounding guests. His reality was shattering into jagged, irreparable pieces. The man who had boasted about buying the visionary, the man who had ordered me to fetch his coat, was now staring at the architect of his impending ruin. I watched his pupils dilate. I watched the frantic calculations running behind his eyes as he tried to reconcile the niece he thought he controlled with the corporate asset he desperately needed. His hedge fund required the holding company to survive. The holding company required the anchor artist. I was the anchor artist. The dynamic had inverted completely. I held the high ground. I held the poison pill. I held the keys to his financial survival. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. His vocal cords were paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the moment. His ego, an entity that had consumed everything in its path for decades, was now trapped in a corner. It was frantically searching for an exit strategy, a loophole, or a way to twist this revelation into a victory. The question hung in the charged air between us. I watched the gears of his mind grind against the undeniable truth, waiting to see if his pride would shatter completely or mutate into something far more dangerous. The air in the gallery felt heavy, thick, with the unspoken realization suspended between us. Richard broke the silence with a laugh. It was a hollow, scraping sound that lacked any genuine mirth. He turned toward the circle of Yale donors standing just a few feet away. He lifted his free hand, gesturing toward the brass plate as if it were a poorly executed joke. He stammered, the smooth cadence of his Wall Street delivery fracturing into uneven syllables. He told the men there had clearly been a clerical error. He suggested the foundry must have mixed up the shipping manifests, or that the museum curators had installed the wrong plaque. He insisted it was a bizarre coincidence. He said there was surely another Florence Montgomery in the art world, someone who actually possessed the capacity to engineer such a structure. He was pleading with his peers to validate his denial. He needed them to agree that the girl standing beside him in the plain black dress could not possibly be the visionary they were all currently worshiping. The silver-haired executive did not laugh. He looked from the engraved letters up to my face. His eyes tracked the calm, unyielding expression I held, and then dropped to the burn scars visible on my bare arms. The pieces connected in his mind. The older man took a subtle step away from Richard. In the upper echelons of Connecticut society, associating with someone who publicly humiliated a highly valued asset was a severe faux pas. Richard felt the social temperature drop. His smile faltered. He looked back at the plaque, his jaw working silently, as his brain struggled to find a new narrative to protect his ego. Before Richard could formulate another excuse, the crowd parted. Alara Vance walked through the corridor of guests. The Vanguard director had abandoned the acrylic podium. She moved with a renewed sense of purpose, her posture no longer weighed down by the corporate surrender she had endured in the VIP suite. She approached the velvet boundary rope. She did not look at my uncle. She bypassed him entirely, treating him as an insignificant obstacle. Alara stepped directly in front of me. She reached out and took both of my hands in hers. She did not shy away from the calluses or the rough texture of my palms. She held my hands up slightly, presenting the physical evidence of my labor to the surrounding audience. Alara turned her head toward the crowd. Her voice was clear and resonant, carrying easily over the hushed whispers. She announced that it was her greatest honor to formally introduce the creator of the evening's centerpiece. She spoke my full name. She called me the defining voice of contemporary industrial sculpture. The confirmation was absolute. There was no room left for clerical errors or coincidences. The applause erupted. It started with the Yale donors in the front row and cascaded backward through the cavernous hall. 300 members of the financial elite put their drinks down and clapped. The sound washed over me, a physical wave of validation that reverberated against the glass walls. It was a surreal inversion of power. The very society that measured human worth by medical degrees and hedge fund portfolios was now bowing to the daughter who chose to bend metal. I glanced at my parents. Their faces had instantly drained of color, leaving their skin a chalky, bloodless hue. My mother looked as though the floor had given way beneath her designer heels. Her entire social architecture was built on the foundation that I was a failure. She had spent the last 2 hours apologizing for my presence, framing me as a burden. Now her wealthy friends were cheering for me. She realized with horrifying clarity that her persistent mockery had not proven her superiority. It had merely exposed her profound ignorance to the most influential people in the state. My father stood rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. He was trapped in a public nightmare. He could not claim credit for a success he had actively tried to destroy, and he could not dismiss a $2.5 million valuation. They were marginalized, reduced to silent spectators in the shadow of my triumph. As the applause continued, I brought my attention back to Richard. The cognitive paralysis that had frozen his features began to thaw. His eyes darted from my face to the towering kinetic bronze, then toward the VIP lounge where the signed documents rested. I watched the exact second his brain realigned the data. The shock evaporated. A new, far more dangerous emotion flooded into the vacuum. Pure, unadulterated avarice. Richard was a corporate raider. His primary instinct was acquisition. He processed the revelation not as a personal defeat, but as a staggering financial windfall. The math computed rapidly in his mind. He had just executed the preliminary agreement. He believed he now owned the Vanguard Arts Group. Vanguard held the exclusive representation rights to my portfolio. Therefore, by his ruthless logic, he now owned me. He looked at the massive sculpture and saw a liquid asset. He looked at me and saw an indentured revenue stream. His failing firm desperately needed an influx of high-value capital, and I had just handed him the most coveted portfolio in the modern art market. The fear of bankruptcy that had driven his hostile takeover vanished, replaced by a euphoric surge of predatory confidence. He stepped into my personal space, invading the small perimeter Alara had created. He reached out and grabbed my right arm. His fingers dug into the fabric of my sleeve, his grip tight and intensely proprietary. It was the physical assertion of a master claiming his property. He pulled me slightly toward him, attempting to hijack the presentation. He raised his scotch glass toward the applauding donors, flashing a wide, triumphant grin. He played the part of the proud patriarch. He projected his voice over the cheering crowd, shouting that the Montgomery family always kept the best talent in-house. He told the silver-haired executive that his new holding company was going to bring my structural genius to the global market. He was attempting to rewrite the history of the entire evening in real time. He wanted the elite society to believe this was a coordinated family triumph, a brilliant corporate synergy orchestrated by his own flawless foresight. He leaned down, his mouth hovering near my ear. The smell of alcohol and desperate ambition was suffocating. He whispered that I had played a very clever game, but the house always won. He told me my days of hiding in a dirty warehouse were over. He said he was going to manage my production schedule personally, and I was going to sculpt his firm out of debt. I stood under the bright gallery lights, feeling the crushing pressure of his hand on my arm. He believed the ink on his contract bound me to his sinking ship. He thought he had outmaneuvered me on the final play. I looked down at his fingers gripping my sleeve, then up into his manic, greedy eyes. The audience continued to clap, entirely unaware of the silent corporate warfare occurring at the edge of the velvet rope. The trap was fully primed, resting on a single, unasked question. Would I allow this Wall Street predator to claim my victory and enslave my future? Richard tightened his grip on my forearm. The applause from the gallery floor continued to echo through the high ceilings as he steered me away from the velvet boundary rope. He pushed through the lingering guests with blunt force. He guided us toward a semi-private alcove tucked between two contemporary photography exhibits. A frosted glass partition shielded the space, offering acoustic isolation while maintaining visual contact with the main hall. He desired a quiet zone to assert his dominance without causing a public spectacle. He released my arm and positioned his broad shoulders to block the exit path. His breathing was rapid and shallow. The adrenaline of his perceived victory flooded his system, making his eyes wide and frantic. He looked at me, no longer seeing a niece to mock, but a newly acquired corporate subsidiary to exploit. He dropped the familial pretense entirely. The patronizing uncle from the Thanksgiving dinner table vanished. The ruthless hedge fund manager replaced him, ready to strip a target down to its foundation. He told me the childish games were over. He stated that hiding behind an anonymous brand was a clever marketing tactic, but now the real adults were taking the reins. He promised to manage my wealth properly, noting that I clearly lacked the business acumen to handle a 7-figure portfolio on my own. He dictated his new terms with rapid-fire delivery. He expected me to double my production output by the next fiscal quarter. He planned to leverage my kinetic sculptures to secure fresh lines of credit for his firm. He described a future where my hands built the financial salvation of his sinking empire. He even outlined a public relations campaign, intending to parade me around to his investors as the prodigy he personally discovered and refined. He assumed my silence indicated submission. He interpreted my lack of tears as a sign of total defeat. I did not yell. I did not cry. I stood with my posture perfectly straight, maintaining the clinical precision of a surgeon preparing to make the first critical incision. To me, dismantling his ego was no different than dismantling a poorly engineered steel truss. You find the point of maximum stress and apply the correct amount of pressure until the foundation shatters. I listened to his entire monologue. I waited until his chest stopped heaving and his arrogant smile settled firmly onto his face. I let him build his imaginary kingdom to its highest peak. Then I spoke. My voice was quiet even, and stripped of any emotional inflection. I told him he misunderstood the fundamental mechanics of the transaction that occurred inside the VIP suite. I broke down the structure of my representation agreement with the Vanguard Arts Group. I explained that standard contracts allowed holding companies to transfer assets during corporate mergers. However, my legal counsel operated far beyond standard practices. I mentioned my lead attorney in Manhattan. I described the specific addendum we drafted mere days ago. I informed him this defensive strategy was born from a very enlightening hypothetical conversation with his own compliance officer. I watched Richard blink. The casual mention of Valerie caused a tiny visible fracture in his confident facade. I continued the operation. I revealed the key artist poison pill. I kept my vocabulary sharp and precise. I explained the rigid terms embedded deep within the Vanguard legal archives. If the holding company underwent a hostile change in corporate ownership without the explicit written consent of my limited liability company, my exhibition agreement became instantly void. I watched his pupils dilate as his brain struggled to process the legal terminology. I translated the corporate jargon into simple, devastating math. I told him his signature on the preliminary acquisition document was the singular trigger. He had executed the takeover. He had bypassed my consent. Therefore, the contract nullified the exact second his monogrammed fountain pen left the paper. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly hue. I did not pause to allow him a moment of recovery. I systematically outlined the immediate consequences of his arrogance. I informed him that I was legally retracting my entire portfolio. The multi-million-dollar kinetic centerpiece standing under the spotlights would be dismantled and removed by my logistics team on Monday morning. All future commissions were officially canceled. The independent appraiser in Geneva had already authenticated the withdrawal. I stepped closer, reducing the physical distance between us. I needed him to hear every single syllable clearly. I explained that 80% of the projected valuation of Vanguard Arts was tied directly to my exclusive representation. By voiding my contract, that staggering valuation evaporated into thin air. I told him his hostile takeover did not save his hedge fund. I explicitly outlined how his actions had just bankrupted his already over-leveraged accounts. He had purchased a hollow shell. He inherited the immense operating costs of a global gallery network without owning the primary asset that generated its revenue. The crushing debt he assumed to finance the buyout would trigger automatic cross defaults across his entire firm. His creditors would descend by Tuesday. I told him he was financially ruined. I had structurally locked him out of my success, using his own greed as the padlock. Richard stared at me in stunned silence. The arrogant Wall Street titan evaporated, replaced by a terrified aging man confronting the collapse of his worldview. His breathing turned shallow and erratic. He pulled at the knot of his silk tie, suddenly finding the collar of his custom shirt too restrictive. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords refused to form a coherent sentence. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out his smartphone. He needed to verify the nightmare. He desperately opened his email application, searching for emergency messages from his legal transition team or the Vanguard board of directors. He held the device in front of his face. His thumb hovered over the glowing glass screen. It was shaking. The tremor was identical to the one I had diagnosed in the library while he poured his scotch at Thanksgiving. That subtle vibration had now magnified into a fierce, uncontrollable shudder. The physical manifestation of his panic was impossible to hide. The financial trap had snapped shut, severing his empire at the root. He was swiping blindly at his screen, watching his net worth disintegrate in real time. I turned away from my uncle. I left him standing alone in the shadowed alcove, trapped in a prison constructed entirely from his own hubris. I walked back out onto the main exhibition floor. The crowd was still mingling, sipping champagne, and discussing the genius of the bronze sculpture under the bright gallery lights. I looked toward the edge of the velvet boundary rope. Standing there, waiting for my return, were my parents. They had watched Richard drag me away into the alcove. They had seen his triumphant smile, and now they were watching him crumble in the shadows. They had built their entire social identity around the illusion of his power and the certainty of my failure. Now the paradigm was fully inverted. The hierarchy they worshipped was lying in ruins on the marble floor. As I walked toward them, their faces reflected a deep, profound terror. What is left for the parents to say? The distance between the shadowed alcove and the velvet boundary rope felt like the longest walk of my life. I left my uncle staring at his glowing screen, watching his net worth dissolve into the digital ether. As I moved across the pristine white marble, the gallery lights felt warmer, casting long, sharp shadows across the exhibition floor. The low hum of the kinetic bronze sculpture served as a steady rhythm, guiding my steps. I kept my eyes focused on the two figures standing near the perimeter of the installation. My parents had watched the entire exchange from afar. They saw Richard drag me into the soundproof room with the swagger of a conqueror, and they saw him remain there, frozen and diminished. They did not need to hear the legal specifics of the poison pill to understand that a catastrophic shift in power had just occurred. The social hierarchy they worshipped was bleeding out on the museum floor. My mother stood rigid, her manicured hands clutching a small silver evening bag. The manufactured confidence she wore like armor was cracking. She was a woman who navigated Connecticut high society by aligning herself the apex predator in any given room. For decades, that predator had been her brother. Now, the man who promised to secure their legacy was trapped in an alcove, ruined by his own hubris. My father shifted his weight from side to side, his jaw tight. He was a man who quantified human value through asset accumulation, and he had just spent years trying to financially starve the most valuable asset his family had ever produced. They were staring at me with a profound, suffocating terror. They were realizing that the daughter they treated as a defective dependent was actually the architect of the evening. Before I could reach them, a subtle shift in the crowd altered the dynamic. The silver-haired executive, the same Yale board member Richard had boasted to earlier, was making his way toward us. He was accompanied by 3 other prominent donors. They were eager to congratulate the newly revealed visionary. In their rigid subculture, success washed away all previous sins. A 7-figure valuation instantaneously transformed my art degree from a frivolous hobby into a stroke of unparalleled genius. My mother spotted the approaching power brokers, her survival instinct activated with terrifying speed. If her brother was a sinking ship, she needed a new vessel to stay afloat. She plastered a bright, artificial smile across her face. The panic in her eyes vanished, replaced by the frantic gleam of a social climber fighting for relevance. She stepped forward, positioning herself between me and the approaching executives. She reached out and attempted to link her arm through mine, projecting the image of a unified, loving matriarch. I kept my arm locked at my side, denying her the physical connection. But she ignored the rejection. She turned to the silver-haired man and projected her voice, ensuring her words carried over the ambient noise of the gala. She proclaimed her overwhelming pride in her daughter. She laughed, a light musical sound that felt entirely synthetic. She told the executives that the Montgomery family had always nurtured my creative spirit. She claimed my father and I spent countless hours discussing structural engineering and the aesthetic value of industrial materials. It was a staggering, breathtaking lie. She was attempting to rewrite history in real time, drafting a narrative where my triumph was the direct result of their unwavering parental support. She patted my shoulder and delivered the final, sickening line. She looked at the Yale donors and said that in their household, family takes care of family. The hypocrisy was a physical weight in the air. The silver-haired executive offered a polite nod, preparing to offer his congratulations. I did not let him speak. I stepped out from behind my mother, breaking her line of sight with the donors. I turned to face her. I did not yell. I did not raise my pitch. I modulated my voice to a quiet, steady frequency that commanded attention precisely because it forced the listener to lean in. The acoustics of the high glass ceiling caught the quiet intensity of my tone, causing the surrounding conversations to halt. A small circle of silence expanded around us. I told her to stop speaking. The command was simple and unyielding. My mother blinked, her artificial smile faltering. She glanced nervously at the executives, silently begging me to maintain the social facade. I refused. I looked directly into her eyes and initiated a verbal audit of their behavior. I began with the Thanksgiving dinner. I recounted the oppressive atmosphere of the Mahogany Library. I described the moment Richard offered me a humiliating entry-level administrative job, framing it as a rescue mission for a failing artist. I reminded her of the brutal 30-day deadline. I kept my delivery clinical and precise. I detailed the threat of financial starvation. I stated that she and my father had promised to freeze my generational trust account if I did not abandon my New Haven foundry. I pointed out that they viewed my artistic labor as a toxic rebellion, a disease they needed to cure with corporate discipline. I listed the years of relentless mockery, the condescending sighs, and the deliberate absence from my university exhibitions. I told the gathered crowd that my parents had brought me to this exact gala, not to celebrate my talent, but to use the event as a psychological battering ram to break my spirit. My father stepped forward, his face flushed with a dark, humiliated anger. He hissed under his breath, demanding that I lower my voice and stop making a public scene. He said we could discuss these minor misunderstandings in private. I turned my gaze to him, freezing him in his tracks. I told him there was no misunderstanding. I explained that he only valued human beings when their net worth exceeded his expectations. I said he was currently attempting to claim a dividend on an investment he had actively tried to destroy. I watched him swallow hard, the truth stripping away the cynical armor he wore to protect his ego. I turned back to my mother. The artificial smile was gone, replaced by a raw, naked dread. The Yale donors were watching the exchange with rapt, silent attention. The whispers had already begun spreading through the exhibition hall like a slow fire. I delivered the final verdict. I rejected their conditional love. I told them my independence was forged in a dirty, freezing warehouse while they sat in their pristine colonial mansion complaining about my choices. I stated with unwavering finality that my success was built in spite of them, not because of them. They contributed nothing to the brass plaque bolted to the marble floor. I told them they no longer possess the leverage to threaten me, and they no longer possess the right to claim me. The trust fund they held over my head was a phantom chain I had broken years ago. I did not need their money, their connections, or their approval. The liberation I felt in that moment was profound. It was the same feeling I experienced when a heavy bronze casting finally cooled and set into its permanent shape. The structural integrity was flawless. I had tested the load-bearing capacity of my own resilience, and I had not fractured. I did not wait for a response. There was no rebuttal they could offer that held any mathematical or emotional value. I turned my back on my parents. The physical movement was a definitive, unbreakable boundary. I walked away from the velvet rope, moving past the silent circle of Yale executives and hedge fund managers. I left my mother and father standing isolated in the middle of the crowded gallery. The spotlight from the kinetic sculpture cast their shadows long and thin across the white marble. They were exposed to the judgment and the whispers of the Connecticut elite they so desperately sought to impress. The social exile they had promised to inflict upon me had become their own permanent reality. I crossed the exhibition hall, my boots moving silently against the polished stone. The oppressive weight of the Montgomery lineage lifted from my shoulders, dissipating into the cool, climate-controlled air of the museum. I walked toward the heavy glass exit doors, leaving the champagne flutes, the ruined corporate raiders, and the shattered social climbers behind me. The night outside was waiting. The final pieces of the board were settling into their new positions, and the only task remaining was to return to the fire and secure my own empire. The Monday following the Greenwich exhibition brought a cold, clear dawn to the financial district. The collapse of a Wall Street firm is rarely a loud event. It does not look like a cinematic explosion. It looks like a sequence of quiet phone calls and frozen digital accounts. Richard arrived at his corner office, expecting to finalize the Vanguard Arts acquisition. Instead, he found his compliance team boxing up their desks. The legal shockwave of the key artist provision had detonated precisely as my attorney engineered. By triggering the poison pill, Richard inherited the operational debt of the gallery network while legally severing the only asset that provided its valuation. He bought a hollow shell. The math caught up to him before lunch. His primary lenders ran the revised projections, saw the vaporized equity, and initiated immediate margin calls across his entire portfolio. His firm lacked the liquid capital to cover the deficit. By Tuesday afternoon, the state appointed a receiver to liquidate his remaining assets. His empire was dismantled in less than 48 hours. Valerie did not stay to watch the ship sink. My Boston Irish sister-in-law possessed an impeccable sense of timing. She walked into his office on Monday morning, placed a single typed page on his mahogany desk, and resigned as his external counsel. She did not offer sympathy or gloat. She simply stated that she was legally obligated to distance herself from gross financial negligence. By noon, she had finalized leases for her own independent practice. By Wednesday, she had successfully courted and retained 4 of Richard's highest-tier clients. They valued her pragmatic foresight over his reckless ego. She secured her own future using the exact same calculated efficiency she recognized in my foundry. We never spoke about the hypothetical conversation she delivered in my warehouse. We did not need to. The results spoke for themselves. The social fallout in Connecticut moved slower than the financial collapse, but the results were equally permanent. High society operates on a currency of perception. My parents had spent decades curating a flawless image, projecting a lineage of unbroken success. That illusion shattered the moment I turned my back on them in the museum. The elite circles they worshipped are unforgiving. Rumors spread through the country club dining rooms and charity board meetings. The prominent Yale donors who witnessed the confrontation shared the story over evening cocktails. The narrative shifted. My parents were no longer respected patriarchs and matriarchs. They became cautionary tales of parental mismanagement. 6 months after the gala, my name appeared in major architectural and art publications. The kinetic bronze sculpture from the exhibition sold to an anonymous international buyer for $3 million. Whenever the topic of my success arose at their social functions, the other country club members offered my parents tight, sympathetic smiles. My mother tried to claim credit. She attempted to weave stories about nurturing my creative spirit during my childhood. The other women simply nodded and changed the subject. Everyone in their circle knew the truth. They knew the brilliant, wealthy daughter refused to answer their phone calls or attend their holiday dinners. My parents were quietly marginalized, invited to fewer galas, and seated at less prominent tables. They were trapped in a paradox, boasting about a legacy that had publicly disowned them. My father spent his evenings in his colonial library staring at financial magazines that chronicled the rise of my industrial brand. Unable to bridge the chasm his own cynicism had created. I did not concern myself with their social decline. I focused entirely on the raw physics of my craft. The New Haven studio remained my sanctuary, but my production scale required expansion. My legal counsel established a new limited liability company to manage my growing real estate acquisitions. The entity was designed to operate quietly, shielding my identity behind layers of corporate privacy. In late October, a significant property entered the foreclosure market. Richard had leveraged his personal assets to delay his firm sinking into receivership. When the bank finally called his debts, they seized his Greenwich waterfront estate. The sprawling multi-million-dollar property went to a closed auction. I directed my Manhattan attorney to place a bid through my anonymous corporate entity. The bank accepted the offer in cash. I stood in the center of my foundry on a Tuesday afternoon. The air was thick with the familiar smell of scorched iron and argon gas. The heavy steel rolling doors were pulled open to let in the autumn breeze. I wore my canvas jacket and leather work boots. A courier had just delivered a thick manila envelope from my legal team. I opened the clasp and slid the documents onto my metal workbench. It was the finalized real estate deed. I ran my calloused thumb over the recorded county stamp. I now held the legal title to Richard's former estate. The irony of the transaction provided a quiet, profound satisfaction. I had no intention of living in the pristine colonial mansion. I possessed zero desire to sleep in rooms designed to project inherited superiority. The property featured a massive reinforced carriage house and sprawling high-ceilinged reception halls. I planned to gut the interior entirely. I was going to tear up the imported hardwood floors, reinforce the foundation with poured concrete, and convert the entire estate into a climate-controlled storage warehouse for my bronze castings. The manicured lawns would soon serve as a loading dock for heavy freight trucks. The monument to his arrogance would become a functional utility space for my labor. I set the deed down next to a stack of raw steel plates. My eyes drifted toward the edge of the workbench. Tucked beneath a heavy grinding wheel was a piece of thick vellum paper. It was the gold-embossed Thanksgiving invitation my mother had sent nearly a year ago. The paper was stained with soot and grease. I had kept it in the studio as a structural reminder. It represented the psychological cage they had tried to build around me. It was the physical manifestation of their ultimatums, their mockery, and their conditional love. I picked up the thick cardstock. The gold lettering caught the sharp glare of the overhead industrial bulbs. I walked across the concrete floor toward the smelting furnace. The internal temperature of the forge burned at over 2,000 degrees. The heat radiated outward, warming my face and hands. I opened the heavy iron door. The roaring orange flames illuminated the dark corners of the warehouse. I did not hesitate. I tossed the invitation into the center of the fire. The thick paper curled inward, darkening at the edges, before igniting in a brief, bright flash. The flames consumed the family crest, the condescending handwritten note, and the memory of the colonial dining room in a matter of seconds. The ash floated upward, drawn into the industrial ventilation system, and scattered into the cold Connecticut sky. I closed the iron door, securing the heavy latch. I walked back to my workstation and picked up my welding hood. I pulled the stiff leather apron over my shoulders and secured the straps across my back. I picked up the plasma cutter, feeling the familiar grounding weight of the tool in my hands. I lowered the dark mask over my face, shutting out the ambient light of the room. The world narrowed to a single, focused point of blue and white heat. The noise of Wall Street, the whispers of high society, and the judgment of my bloodline were entirely silent. True success is not inherited. It is built, piece by piece, under the fire of your own making. We spend our lives building monuments. Some of us build them out of glass and steel, reaching into the skyline to announce our wealth to the world. Others build them out of expectations, stacking heavy, unyielding demands onto the shoulders of the children we are supposed to nurture. When I look back at the story of Florence Montgomery, a master sculptor who dismantled her uncle's Wall Street empire and walked away from her parents' conditional affection, I do not just see a satisfying tale of corporate retribution. I see a profound, devastating autopsy of the American family. In the relentless pursuit of the American dream, particularly within the rigid, prestige-obsessed corridors of old money, we frequently confuse guidance with ownership. Florence's parents did not view her as a human being with an independent soul. They viewed her as a portfolio asset that was underperforming. They worshipped the medical degree of their son and the financial leverage of her uncle, measuring human worth exclusively by the metrics of high society approval and visible affluence. This is the tragic flaw embedded in so many traditional family structures, the insidious, unspoken belief that love is a dividend paid only when a child meets specific, socially acceptable benchmarks. Raising a child within a traditional framework should offer a sanctuary of unwavering support, a safe harbor where a young mind can explore its own potential without the looming threat of exile. Yet for Florence, the colonial mansion was not a home. It was a courtroom. True family responsibility requires an emotional awareness that the Montgomerys entirely lacked. Guiding a child is not about forging a replica of yourself, nor is it about crafting a trophy to display at a country club luncheon to validate your own parenting skills. It requires the quiet, often uncomfortable work of honesty and fairness. It means looking at a daughter who comes home with soot under her fingernails and burn scars on her palms, and recognizing the intense, beautiful dedication in her labor, even if it does not fit the manicured mold of an Ivy League law firm. Florence possessed the structural integrity to fuse bronze, but her parents lacked the moral integrity to see her clearly. Instead of nurturing her fire, they weaponized her survival. They used the threat of financial starvation to force her into a corporate cage, believing that control was synonymous with care. When honesty is replaced by social posturing, children do not learn obedience. They learn how to build armor. Florence built hers out of iron, and when the time came, she used it to shatter the glass house her family lived in. She survived because she recognized early on that her parents' currency was conditional. But we must ask ourselves, what is lost when a child has to learn the ruthless mechanics of survival at their own dining room table? The tragedy is not that Florence had to defeat her uncle in a boardroom maneuver. The tragedy is that she had to view her family as adversaries in the first place. The resonance of Florence's journey lies in its universal familiarity. We have all, at some point, sat across a table and felt the crushing weight of someone else's unfulfilled expectations pressing down on our chests. We have all smiled politely while our genuine passions were reduced to trivial hobbies by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The sting of being unseen by those closest to us is a universal ache. If you have ever been the child forced to carve your own path through the heavy stone of familial judgment, or if you simply find solace in hearing how ordinary people reclaim their power from toxic hierarchies, you are not alone in this experience. Join our growing community and follow Luck Vengeance. We explore the quiet, methodical ways people take back their dignity, one narrative at a time, reminding you that your worth is never defined by the people who fail to see it. When the dust finally settled in that Greenwich Museum, the most striking image was not the ruined hedge fund manager clutching his phone, nor was it the $3 million kinetic sculpture slowly turning under the spotlights. It was the sight of a mother and father standing isolated in a crowded room, realizing that they had successfully driven away the most brilliant mind their lineage had ever produced. They spent decades trying to teach Florence about the real world, failing entirely to understand that she had already mastered it on her own terms. This brings us to a quiet, unsettling truth about the nature of family, a truth that cuts against the grain of everything we are traditionally taught. Society relentlessly preaches that blood is thicker than water. We are conditioned to believe that we owe an unpayable debt of gratitude to the people who brought us into the world, and that familial loyalty must be preserved regardless of the emotional cost. We are told that a good child endures, forgives, and bends their own spine to fit the ancestral frame. But perhaps that is the greatest, most damaging lie we pass down through the generations. Perhaps true responsibility does not mean preserving the family unit at the expense of your own soul. The highest form of parenting is not securing a child's financial future, nor is it guaranteeing their social standing. It is giving them the emotional freedom to walk away from you if you become a barrier to their growth. Love is not a debt to be collected at the end of a fiscal quarter. It is a foundation to be built upon. And if that foundation is rotten, if it requires the suppression of your true self to maintain its balance, the most honorable, authentic choice a person can make is to strike the match. It is to burn the expectations to ash, turn your back on the inheritance, and walk into the dark to build a home of your own. Sometimes, the only way to truly honor your life is to become the willing architect of your own orphanhood.